te pone en rojo.
Rojo. Y
Inglés,
selecciono mi
el idioma,
idioma.
que es inglés y
No te
español.
preocupes porque...
Good morning, everyone. We will commence shortly, so if you could take a seat, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. The main speakers are on their way, so if you could please be seated, we will commence shortly. Maybe they stopped to get a coffee on the way.
Quizás pararon a tomar un café en el camino.
Thank you. It's fantastic to have you here. Good morning, all, and welcome to the SCE Policy Dialogue on understanding the nexus between digital connectivity and formalisation in the Asia Pacific. One of APEC's priorities for 2024 is innovation and digitalisation to promote the transition to the formal and global economy. Transitioning from informality to formality not only benefits individual workers, but also contributes to economic development and social progress. Formality facilitates economic growth by facilitating investment, innovation, and productivity. For individuals, it provides more stability, more predictable work, and regular income. This stability is crucial for improving living standards and reducing poverty. We can use advances in digital technology to enable this process. Peru hopes to work with all economies to produce a roadmap for transition to formality, and the dialogue today will feed into this process. I'm honoured to commence today by inviting Ambassador Eric Anderson Machado, Secretary General of Foreign Affairs in Peru, to present the opening remarks. Thank you, Secretary General.
Good morning. Distinguished APEC senior officials, Honorable Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat, respected panelists, especially I want to give a warm welcome to our main panelist, Dr. Hernando de Soto. Today is a really great honor to have you here. Honored guests, it is with a great pleasure that I extend a cordial welcome to each one of you. Your presence at this significant event focusing on the intricate interplay between digital connectivity and formalization in the Asia-Pacific region is deeply appreciated. As we navigate through a challenging landscape, both globally and regionally, it becomes increasingly evident that fostering cooperation is paramount to advancing towards a more equitable, sustainable, and inclusive economics paradigm. Mindful of this imperative, APEC Peru 2024 is committed to steering a forward-looking agenda encapsulated by the theme Empower, Include, Grow. These words epitomize a progressive trajectory underscoring our dedication to nurturing sustainable economic development. We acknowledge that true growth requires social inclusion, and such inclusion cannot be realized without empowering our citizens, in particular the most vulnerable. Within this thematic framework, Peru has outlined 3 focus areas. First, trade and investment for inclusive and interconnected growth. Second, innovation and digitalization to promote the transition to the formal and global economy. And third, sustainable growth for resilient development. These priorities will give us the chance to address relevant issues comprehensively. Promoting the transition to the formal and global economy is one of the pathways that will enable our economic actors, particularly the most vulnerable ones, to achieve prosperity. In doing so, sound public policies, good practices, and enabling environments would be critical. By taking advantage of the transformative digital technologies that are shaping our economies today, we might be able to improve the lives of our citizens. Digitalization has emerged as a potent catalyst to foster a transition to formal economy. It is precisely the reason why there is a clear need to better understand its transformative potential. In response, Peru has proposed the development of a comprehensive roadmap for transitioning to the formal economy in collaboration with all APEC economies. Envisioned as a robust framework to accelerate APEC's initiatives, the roadmap aligns deeply with APEC visions of fostering robust, equitable, secure, sustainable, and inclusive growth. Additionally, this document will serve as a cornerstone for future projects and partnerships, bolstering both individual and collective effort within APEC while informing domestic policy frameworks. We are profoundly grateful for the support of APEC economics and their willingness to collaborate with Peru on these crucial initiatives. To this end, we have shared a key elements table, now to be known as KET, delineating key areas and proposed actions that could constitute components of the roadmap. We eagerly await your invaluable feedback to facilitate the drafting of a preliminary version of the roadmap in the following weeks. Furthermore, during Peru's APEC presidency, we intend to organize a series of public-private dialogues and workshops aimed at garnering recommendations and best practices that can inform the development of the roadmap. This document will inform and guide policymakers seeking to implement measures conducive to transitioning informal economic actors into the formal economy. It is our fervent hope that the engagement of our esteemed panelists and APEC's senior officials will enrich our deliberations and galvanize our efforts towards the realization of the roadmap. Additionally, it is also important to emphasize the significance of Peru's roles as APEC's chair this year, considering its active engagement with other regional and multilateral forums and processes, notably with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, as Peru advances towards its accession. It's worth noting that 8 APEC economies are already esteemed members of the OECD: Australia, Canada, Chile, Japan, Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, and the United States. We are confident that we can leverage their valuable experience to further our collective objective in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to all participants for their unwavering commitment and invaluable contributions to today's discussion. My best wishes go to all senior officials and delegates for a productive discussion and an enjoyable stay in Peru. With these words, I declare this APEC policy dialogue on understanding the nexus between digital connectivity and formalization in the Asia-Pacific officially opened. I wish you all a very productive journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your welcoming remarks and also for the introduction to the initiatives Peru will conduct this year. We will now move on to the keynote address by Mr. Hernando de Soto, President of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. Mr. de Soto is a globally renowned Peruvian economist with recognized expertise on the informal economy. Welcome to the stage, Mr. de Soto.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much for inviting me, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Ambassador. I thank you for calling me an expert on the informal economy, and I'm not too sure that that's the case. What I do think is I know something a little bit about the formal economy, which is what, in the case of my country, doesn't really work. It's the other way around. So let's begin by looking at it, what I thought was to try and make it as interesting as possible, is that to address to the second part that the Secretary General of my country, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, referred to, which is how do you make the transition from an informal to a formal economy? Now, if you want to know how difficult it is, you've come to the right place, Peru. And so I'll be talking about that because I'd like to talk about concrete things that are happening and not just talk about how an operation is and not have the corpse in front of us. So I hope to be getting into a few things that I may be able to tell you that you won't hear necessarily everywhere else. First of all, I think it's important to know in the case of Peru where we're at and how we see it concretely. We are, of course, within the APEC region, and that's the Asia Pacific. Now, the question is, how do you do a roadmap, as the Secretary General was saying, from informality to formality? Well, the reply to that is there's plenty of experience in the world if we understand that that there's other words for talking about that roadmap that are not from informality to formality. Basically, it's a very old problem. This began with the Industrial Revolution, when the feudal systems of Europe started breaking apart, when empires started dissolving. Marx came out and said, you know, everything that's solid is melting. The old system whereby every graveyard, every church was the one that told you who owned what and where also fell apart because the market economy meant that people started moving around. It was a huge revolution. Now, during that whole revolution, the whole issue was how do we get from there to here? And that even affected Adam Smith, who simply said the problem to get from the rule of law to something that is a new rule of law, he said, is a wagon way through the air. And 80 years later, Marx referred to his work, as a matter of fact, to move from something that is not rule of law to the rule of law, and he called it transmutation. So we have two examples there that, of course, at that time, nobody talked about the informal economy, because it was a collapsing economy, and we weren't yet nations. You know, Europeans went to war, huge amounts of invasions took place, colonization, the Europeans went out. There were civil wars in the United States. You may not know it, but there was I recommend you read it, a huge exchange of epistolar letters between Abraham Lincoln and Karl Marx. All of them were talking basically about formalization. And so the question is, there's plenty of experience, and one of the ways to look at it is to see what successful countries have actually done about it. Now, in that sense, what's important is to look at success stories. So I'm going to start off with one success story, which is China. Now, it's a success story, let me tell you, because originally this just simply tells you how old and senior I am around here, but I closed the first deal between Peru and China back in 1972, when we went out, even before Nixon and Kissinger got there, and sold copper to China. We broke the traditional standards, and thank goodness Nixon and Kissinger came in afterwards, so everything was formalized. But it wasn't very formal. It wasn't supposed a formal deal, because our copper and other stuff was committed elsewhere. It was a very successful thing. But here's what's important, as I started telling myself, asking myself what I was going to tell you today. It is that when we reached China in 1972, during the full Cultural Revolution, the GNP per capita of China was $130. And while in Peru, we were $1,000. In other words, at that time, we were not very impressed by China, because we had about 20 times the GNP per capita. And it remained so until 1989. And you could see that they tried the Cultural Revolution. There was all sorts of movements. But somehow or other, around the year 2000, and then definitely 10 years later, China took off. China took off at an incredible speed, and today, China, we don't have like 20 times the GNP of China. We're half of China's GNP. So they grew enormously. And if you ask them, did they formalize, they'll probably not use the word formalize. President Xi Jinping, as a matter of fact, has a formula for what I consider his formalization program, which is, he calls it my independent knowledge system. And that goes back to Marx, and that goes back to Adam Smith, whereby the idea is when you have a disorder that's informality, the first thing you need is information. What's going on? What can I learn of what's going on so that I can structure it in such a way that we can move to the crucial part of an industrial economy, which is essentially how do you get scale? Industry and technology means scale. And scale means standards. And informal economy means an economy that doesn't have the standards that everybody else has. And so we've tried to see what he has done. And among other things, not because we're necessarily ready to go to China and keep on talking about this anymore, but essentially because in my country, in our country, Peru today, the big deal is minerals. I mean, all of a sudden, what we've got underground here in Peru are some of the largest copper reserves in the world. Now, why is that important? Copper, lithium, silver, gold. I think we're the second gold producer in the world. It's because we call them the electric metals. What's happening now is that there is a drive worldwide, especially in the West, towards clean energy. Now, clean energy means that you are not going to use fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, or gas, but you are going to use the clean metals and all of the clean energy, hydraulic power. You're going to use nuclear power. You're going to use the wind, none of which travel through tubes. They travel through wires. So we, with Chile, produce 48% of copper exports in the world, and with, I think, lithium, we're about 80%. So we're going to be very important in this transition. And that transition will also take us to very touchy spots. If the mines of Peru produce for everybody, then Europe can move towards an independence from Russia, which actually supplies half of their energy of Western Europe, and then become not independent, not so dependent from Russia at a time when, of course, everybody knows there's a conflict going on in the Ukraine. So where does this Peruvian copper go? Who makes the biggest investments is going to pretty much determine in Peru whether the Europeans and the Westerns can have a certain independence from what they call the more noxious power of Russia. Now, this is very political what I'm talking to you about, but as you may know, formalization is a very political subject. You're talking about changing the law. That's what governments are all about. So here is the issue then. If we've got all of this, then if we've got all of these minerals and metals here, plus we've got the best ports on the western side of Latin America. I mean, earthquakes do have a good side to them, which is that our coasts continually is falling down, as we call earthquakes in Peru, but it's given us the best ports within the region. So that means we've all of a sudden become rather important. And then to us, it's very important to know what China thinks about all this, what the United States thinks about all this, because they would all like to have, of course, a priority position regarding investments in our country. Now, the issue here is that, and that's where the informal economy comes into play, is that all of these reserves that we have in the Andes, and concretely in Peru, in what we call Peru's mining corridor, lie below land that is owned by the informal economy. In other words, it isn't like it was like about 10 years ago. Now in Peru, because of everything that happened in the ILO, the 169 resolution, the Fair Global Practices Conference, which took place in Geneva, And all the results of these different international agreements, which are now in practice, which establish that the people who have the property on top of the subsoil, which is governed by the state according to sovereign law, have to be not only consulted, but they have to be part of the deal. So we have something that is called, in China, when referring to Peru, local conflicts. These conflicts are conflicts between the informal and, of course, formal law. Because what is happening now more and more is that if you don't make a deal with the informal sector, we're not going to be able to get to all of those minerals. So I brought this bottle along because this will allow me to explain what's going on. So here's Peru with all its riches. I may be talking about Chile as well in the situation, maybe Bolivia, and many countries throughout the developing world. And this is sovereign territory, everything that's underground. Roman law says that this cannot be bought and sold because it's sovereign. Sovereignty cannot be bought and sold. So when you want to get to most of the third world, you want to get to this, you can't own it at the beginning. What you can get is a concession. A concession is the right to extract. Once you extract, and your minerals, those that actually help you get all the energy that you need to move towards clean energy, to move towards independence, to move towards technology which travels with electric metals, that's energy, you have to be able at that time to get it out. But it just so happens that guess who owns the bottle cap? The informal sector. Now, there's no way you're going to make a deal with the informal sector unless you bring it into the formal economy. Because what's occurring now, as Chinese miners know, as Canadian miners know, as American miners know, as English miners know in South Africa, is that the informal sector is doing this. Now, don't watch the bottle, watch my face. So it's not just a theoretical issue. This is crucial to find out where the world is going, not only where we came from, but that we're part of the Industrial Revolution. This is, after 160 years, a continuation of a battle between when the Industrial Revolution came along and people were disoriented, and how do we create one rule of law at a national level first, and then an international level. Two gentlemen came around and said, you see what's happening? We need knowledge. And now at least we know it's a knowledge problem. What is that informal economy doing? What are all these cowboys shooting it up in the West doing? What are all these Cossacks invading here and there doing? What is the taking of the Bastille all about? Why are they guillotining each other? Why did Napoleon take over the territory of Louis XIV? Why did the French win the war against Prussia in 1006, which obliged them to integrate their informal sector in the formal economy through the Grünbuch system? The reply to all of that is two guys came along and said, all that knowledge, don't worry, let me get it organized for you. One guy was called Adam Smith, and the other guy was called Karl Marx. We're going to organize it for you. Now, you're going to say, well, that was a history. That's going on today. It's not so very different. China is one of the most extraordinary examples, which I think we have to watch today, because they're a big power, but they're in transition to a formal economy. And they're doing it very well, and they have actually done what Marx said had to be done, which is we believe in capital. I mean, it's not that they don't believe in capital, they do believe in capital. That's what Marx said was the overwhelming thing, which of course Adam Smith agreed with. However, they said, to get to that, to get to capital, we have to go along a Marxist basis, which is very different from the base that the West propounds. We believe, like Marx said, and this I am quoting Xi Jinping, is he said, we believe that the way you start off to get from an asset to something that when it's formalized can actually bring capital into existence, those words, bring it into existence, you need to start off by owning the raw materials. Once you own the raw materials, then these raw materials, you have a telescopic vision that takes you from A to Z, all the way to be able to realize the surplus value that is locked up, or that is potentially there, because you know not what prices are. Prices, they are very subjective. They are also a result of speculation, and a lot of teenagers and yuppies shouting at a pit, I'll pay so much for this. There's a scientific way of determining the real value of things, which doesn't go by prices, but goes by what are the costs of production. And you will only know the cost of production if you own the raw material, and you look ahead, and instead of looking at where things are traded, look at the costs of production as they transform and pass from one authority to the other. That Marx and Xi Jinping calls a juncture at which you can then not only spot a surplus value, what you can then also do is find shortcuts. You find out where all the problems are. You find out where all the blockages are. It's a very systematic list, which if you ask me, it's a formalization program. It's very simple. You're cutting costs of getting from something that's raw material all the way to something that's industrial. And then you're able to find out that you can actually save a huge amount of the cost of going from informal to formal, or from just a raw material to the capital markets. And that is capital. And so what they do at that point is, with this value that is in my accounts, that is in my book of accounts, I have this surplus value, which I then am able to document in such a way that when I go to the Bank of China or I go to any other bank, I will have it recognized as an asset. And if I'm recognized as an asset, and in the books through which the insert window works, in the books it's put as an asset, I've got capital. And I haven't gone to the money markets. I've got capital. And when I've got that capital, that means that abracadabra, with the moment I need to do a new project, it's there. And I can therefore have that capital way before even the mine starts working. It's genial. It's fantastic. You see, everybody thought that these were just crazy ideas of Karl Marx. But what he's done, what Xi Jinping has done, is he's converted into a reality. And it's a protocol system. So the first thing I would, if I were, where are we? Yeah. If the government of Peru, called, I would study the Chinese in and out because they're there. But it's not only because of that. It's also because that's where Peru has most of its social problems. I repeat, the mining corridor, the state owns everything that's in the subsoil. It's not a merchandise. It's got to be taken out to be a merchandise, like in every country that follows statutory and Roman law. And then what you have to do is make a deal with whoever now holds the territory on top, the bottle cap, which are the informals. And the informals are very unhappy. Because they're very unhappy because the traditional way in Peru is, what's your land worth? And the reply is, well, it's worth what I need to grow potatoes. Great. Let's put in the best potatoes. Here's your compensation. Now, everything's fine while everybody pokes around making holes to find out how much minerals there are below the ground. But when all of a sudden you strike it rich, the minerals are there, you're the people of Huancuire, which is where Chinese have some of the biggest mines in Peru, Las Bambas. There you are on top. And now you need labor because there's only 700 families living in Huancuire. And then at that moment, when you've got to set installments, all of a sudden these 700 families are invaded by 10,000 workers, guided by Australians, by New Zealanders, by Americans from different places the Chinese have contracted. And then all of a sudden the richest guy in town ain't the richest guy, some blue-eyed boy with a lot of yellow hair. Now what do you do in that side of situation? So the reply to that, and that's the challenge from our point of view, is informality means that you go from a local market to a global market. Because if you can put this cap and formalize it, what does it mean to formalize it? It means to be able to get that the people interested want to be formalized, and you tell them, instead of getting this cap valued at the price of growing potatoes, you're going to get it at the price of selling minerals in Wall Street or in the London Metal Exchange, and you're going to be a billionaire from now on. They will formalize. If you just simply said, look, this is a kooky little project that I did at Princeton University, at Universidad Católica del Perú, they're not going to come in. They're going to come in if this goes formal and can go global. So what I would therefore what I would try and come and tell you is the following thing. If you then say, all right, so what we have to do with the Peruvians is do what the Chinese did, or what the Americans did, because they're both formal countries. So what is it that made that when I went to China, Cultural Revolution 1972, and it had $130 GNP per capita, and that didn't change until about 1990, which is when China started really growing, and much more just only 10, 12 years ago. What is it they did? Well, I have to look at Chinese companies. And when I look at a Chinese company, what do I see? They have limited liability, which means that you can lower your liabilities, you can lower your risk, you can form a corporation. You do not deal with the head of a community because he's a political figure. He can come and he can go. And besides, nobody's ever given credit or capital to anybody who has feathers on their head or has a chuyo on their head. That's not going to happen. They got to form a corporation. What else do they have? Well, let me read you just briefly part of the list. If you go and see what a Chinese company does when it's in there, it can use all the metals to guarantee credits. It can partition all the assets in such a way that you can spread it to different shareholders. You can also take them to pay debts. You can also divide them into shares. Why only do you have to own the land when you can own the share in a large corporation and trade it and go back and forth? Why do you have to be a miner when you can also be a dentist if you take the money and put your kid to school? It has to be flexible. It's got to be able to be established there. You've got to establish perpetual succession, which means inheritance. In other words, you don't go back for a political meeting every year to see who gets what land. You've got to be able to put that, you've got to put that land in somebody's name, and his kids or his inheritors can take it. You need to have hierarchies that are not political hierarchies, they're corporate hierarchies. You've got to invite in new partners. If I take all of these Chinese companies, what they're doing in Peru has nothing to do with China that I saw in 1972 that was talking about something different. And if you look at that formalization and you see what the United States did, it's exactly the same thing. So what that tells you when you're looking at an issue, which is how do we get, as you were saying, Mr. Secretary General, a consensus on what formalization should be about. The idea is you're going to get a consensus because that's what hopefully we human beings are capable of. But the question is, are you going to make an absolute consensus? Are we going to agree on everything? And there's a big confusion there. Human beings cannot agree on everything. But what you can do is go for common ground. And the common ground is what an American has to do to become legal and own a mine in Peru, what a Chinese can do and do the same thing in Peru, even though they have different objectives. Marx and Xi Jinping sees a different destiny than the one of Joe Biden or Trump, but the process is the same. So that common ground is something that you can agree upon. But it involves finding out not what we have to do in developing, what we want to do in, what we think we should do in developing countries on what we know about the informal sector. It has to do with how do two modern countries today, which are right in the middle of the third world, engaged in competing over natural resources, how did they get there? What is it that they did? And you'll find out that they did exactly the same thing, but with their own particularities. And the issue there is when you have to look at both of them, if we can accept that they can compete on that basis, then we will be able to get closer. They have a different marketing strategy as well in their formalization programs. The way that the Chinese go about it is that they've seen something that many Americans have not seen. It's really interesting. You see, in the States, once you've got a property right on the surface of something, you own the whole metals all the way down, right? You can go halfway down to China and it's yours. Now, the way it really works is that in Latin America, is that the state manages the underground, as we said before, the subsoil, and the private sector is the market economy. Those are laws, those are rules, that's the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, that's the IMF, that's the free trade agreements, and all of that. Now, the way, therefore, the Chinese actually are able to compete is because they have focused on those who run the subsoil. They're a government, they know what it is to be a government, they know that governments, like all of us who have been one way or another involved in the public service we want long-term growth. We want to be able to not only have the mineral extracted here, we want to industrialize it, we want to conquer markets abroad, we want to technify, we want to have economies of scale. And the Chinese can come in and say, I know how to do that. I know how to do the whole chain. I can not only extract, I can not only industrialize, I can put a beautiful port, the one you've never seen before. I've seen people, Peruvians go traveling to China, singing a little song saying from Shanghai to Shanghai. I can do all of that, all the way down, A to Z. Now, can the Americans do that? Of course they can't, because it's anti-collusion. That vertical integration is considered monopolies, is an anti-collusion. So here we're going to see two models come along, and it isn't like in the old days where now you are going to be able to see, and that goes for Peru's political future as well, that you're going to be able to say, look, you've got to ignore what all of these guys who are Marxists have done. You've got to ignore it, because look at Cuba, cheapers. Look at one of these African republics that is Marxist. They're getting nowhere. But if today you have no American investment coming into Peru because they are being out-competed by the Chinese, they're not winning any of the tenders, right? In 3 years or 2 years' time, when Peruvians go to the polls and they're going to be told, hey, look at Miami and look at New York and look at London, I don't have to go there. Look at Peru. Everything that's modern, that's good, that's big, is Chinese. You can tell where this country is going to go. So what happens to the informal sector is not only a technical exercise, it's all about our future. It's all about how now that China has risen to compete and effectively with the West. What is the West going to offer so we can get the best solution, have common ground, and peacefully move? Not necessarily to get one model or the other model, but a little bit of this. What's that thing called? Mambo number 5? A little bit of this, a little bit of that. Obviously, the Chinese, what they've got, all Latin Americans laugh. Because why? Because we like beautiful women, but a little bit of this and a little bit of that is what's going to happen. So the important thing is that it happens peacefully, and that we do whatever, at least we think, whatever we have to do, formalization based in reality, which is, it's an old problem. It's not a new problem. It's been going on since the Industrial Revolution for 200 years, and you've got a think tank led by President Xi Jinping, who's an intellectual. You have to read the stuff. This man's formed 3 universities. You can read all about it. These guys have revitalized and rejuvenated Marxism in probably the same way that Milei is trying to rejuvenate capitalism in Latin America. But that's where we're at. That's what's happening. And if you want to find the key to that, it's called informality. Now, I don't have to look at it much to know that I've reached a limit of what I have to talk to you about, because you already got up. So I'm going to thank you very much for your time and for these reflections. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. De Soto, for your valuable insights. You said at the start your goal was to make it interesting, and I can tell you, right now that you succeeded in that. I could have listened to you for the next hour, but unfortunately we have a packed schedule. Specifically, I didn't know that there were letters between Abraham Lincoln and Karl Marx. I'm going to go read these, but if you want to send out the Hernando de Soto reading list. I'm sure everyone here would very much enjoy that. I would also like to thank Ambassador Eric Anderson for his attendance today. Everyone, can you please remain seated for this short pause while the Secretary General exits and we prepare the stage for the next session. Thank you. Yeah, that's here. I'm sure your presentation. That was dying actually. No, of course not. But it's sometimes hard to make these topics seem like it's for the general public. Sorry? Yes, so you can sit down and I will.
Sí,
rojo,
nada más.
sin abrir.
Thank you. We will now move on to our panel discussions. Peru's senior official for APEC, Mr. Renato Reyes Tagles, will moderate this session. We will do the first presentations and then we will have a Q&A at the end of this dialogue. So please hold your questions to the Q&A session at the end. Our first panelist is Ms. Corinne Delesha, Assistant Director, Asia and Pacific Department for the International Monetary Fund, who brings a wealth of experience on this topic. Her presentation is addressing informality, a priority for inclusive growth. Thank you, Mrs. Delesha. Please come to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador, for your introduction. Distinguished delegates, it's a very difficult task that I have to immediately follow after Dr. De Soto. For that, I apologize. I'll do my best. And I'm also the first of the presentations. So think of this as planting the decor. I'm going to have a more macro perspective on things, and my colleagues that follow will be more specific. The one thing I didn't know is I'm an alumni of the same school in Geneva as Dr. De Soto. So he's an honorable alumni of the Graduate Institute, where I graduated after him. So this presentation will cover broad topics. First, why informality matters in terms of size and macroeconomic impact. I'll go briefly over the drivers of informality. Then touch on the role of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in accelerating digitalization trends. And on policy, I'll touch on policies to facilitate the transition to the formal economy and try to leave you with broad conclusions. So first, what are we talking about? So a broad definition. So informality, as Dr. De Soto rightly mentioned, is not a fixed concept. It's a very complex, pervasive, and persistent phenomenon that takes many forms within and between countries. For example, an informal person can be self-employed agriculture worker, a street vendor, or it can be a thriving small business that's not registered. And within that definition, you immediately see that there's a notion of choice. The agricultural worker may not necessarily have a choice. Informality might be the only way he can get an income, versus the small business in Europe may just decide to not be registered because the cost-benefit analysis is in the favor of remaining informal, maybe because taxes are too high, etc. So one definition that can be used is informal activities as all activities that, if they were recorded, they would contribute to GDP and does not cover illegal activities or household production. This is the definition we use in the book, the covers of which you saw at the beginning. The ILO has a similar definition, which is all economic activities by workers and economic units that are in law or practice not covered or insufficiently covered by formal arrangements. And that includes employment in the informal sector and informal employment in the formal sector. So how large is informality around the world? So this is difficult to measure almost by nature because informal activities are not recorded. So there's basically been two ways of estimating the size of the informal economy. One was direct approaches, surveys and samples. The drawback of surveys, of course, is that they have different coverage across countries and across time. There's reporting bias. And then there's indirect approaches that try to infer the size of the informal economy based on one variable, such as cash in circulation, electricity demand. And then there's methods that are a bit more promising that are based on models and structural equations that allow you to estimate the size of the informal economy across a large number of countries and over time. So that's the last two you see on the slide, the dynamic general equilibrium and the multiple indicators, multiple cause model. So I'm not going to go too much into the details, but both methods will yield estimates of the informal economy that are consistent. According to these methods, the informal economy represents about 30% of global output, about 35% in low and medium-sized economies, and 15% in advanced economies. So it's quite large. And if you look at the ILO definition, which has done a very large survey of informal economy around the world, that covers about 2 billion workers, or 60% of the world population. So the first important message is that informality is large. It's a very significant phenomenon. If you look at what it looks like in APEC, the slide on the chart on the left shows you the big difference between APEC advanced economies and APEC emerging economies. Very significant difference. You also see that informality has been slowly declining over time, a bit faster in emerging economies. Then if you look at the chart on the right, you see the wide diversity of experience around in APEC. You have on the left the lowest amount of informality in the US and Singapore, between 5 and 10% of the economy. And Peru and Thailand are on the right at over 40, 45% of the economy. So as Dr. De Soto, Peru is a country where informality is a very significant phenomenon. So what are the macroeconomic implications of having such large parts of the economy that are informal? I mean, first, informal production units tend to remain small. They can't grow because they can't access working capital. So countries with large amounts of informality tend to have low productivity, and therefore they grow below their potential. Countries with high informality also tend to have high poverty. In Cameroon and Rwanda, 98% of the poor are in the informal sector. There's also a tendency to have higher inequality, including gender inequality. So globally, you have more men than women in the informal sector, but in some regions, like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, you do have more women in the informal sector, and they have a significant wage gap as well. The other impact of having a large informal sector, you forego tax revenues because people in the informal sector don't pay taxes. That prevents the government from providing essential public services, and that reinforces the incentives to be in the informal sector. Within APEC, the policy brief that was prepared by the APEC Policy Support Unit finds that 5% of GDP is lost from foregone taxes, and can be up to 9% of GDP in countries with high informality. So very significant economic impacts, which brings me to my second important message, which is tackling informality is essential for inclusive growth, as the Secretary General was mentioning in the beginning. The other thing that is important to note is that even though informality can take many forms, the vast majority of informal workers don't have a choice. It is by necessity because there's not enough production opportunities in the formal sector. 85% of all informal workers globally, so 85% of these 2 billion, are in precarious employment in small production units, according to the ILO data. So I'll go very briefly over the drivers of informality because I don't want to spend too long. But basically, they tend to take multiple forms, and they shape informality differently depending on the country. Some countries have low income and just the economy is not able to create enough formal jobs. For example, in Senegal, you have 200,000 youth entering the job market every year, and only 10% of all jobs are formal. So that's one. And then you have the other side of the coin, the demand side, where the workforce may not be educated enough or qualified to participate in the formal sector. There's also the quality of institution that matters, insufficient law enforcement, lack of trust in public institutions, and then very importantly, the shape of fiscal institutions, so the design of the tax system and social protection. If the tax system is burdensome, you have to do many steps to register, to pay taxes. Is the threshold for VAT too low for small business? All these factors will have an impact. And financial inclusion, of course, that's been long known as being a big obstacle to formalization for small firms for various reasons. Sometimes they don't have collateral because of land titling, land rights issues. Sometimes they just don't have the knowledge to prepare a bankable project. And then the regulatory framework that will be talked about more later today, the law, labor and product market regulation. Is it hard to fire workers like in Latin America? Again, land ownership or all issues around competition policies. So all these drivers of informality will differ across countries. So it's not a uniform phenomenon. And that will highlight the importance of conducting a diagnostic of what drives informality in a specific country. So this refers back to what Professor De Soto was saying about, there is a common ground, which is the importance of tackling informality, but it will take the specifics, and the specific policies will take different forms depending on the country. And the other important message is, because of all these drivers and facets of informality, one single intervention will not do it. You will require a set of coordinated intervention to get the job done, and it will take time. So what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, the pandemic can be seen as having done basically two things. One, it shed a light on the importance of reaching the most vulnerable in an emergency, like the pandemic. The pandemic impacted the most vulnerable informal workers the most, because they work in contact-intensive jobs, like the domestic workers, the street vendors. They have no possibility to do their job at home. 90 million people who were already poor fell below extreme poverty during the pandemic at the beginning. If you think of domestic workers, some of the most impacted, women make up 72% of total domestic workers. In Thailand, the tourism sector, which is largely informal, was massively affected by the lockdown. So governments had to find a way to move quickly and to reach vulnerable people who were unregistered, and using contactless means if possible. So the use of digital tools was accelerated. There's an APEC brief that was prepared during Thailand's presidency of APEC in 2022 that summarizes the use of digital solutions in APEC. I'll just mention the one at the bottom about digital cash transfers, which was also used in 140 countries around the world. Countries had to innovate, and they tried to build on existing registers when they had one. In Togo, they didn't have one, but they built something from scratch using the national voter ID that also had the occupation of the worker to identify the vulnerable people. And within 2 months, they had covered almost 1 million people with a scheme that would transfer money through mobile phones. In Brazil, the Auxílio Emergencial program was widely successful and delivered support to like 60% of the workforce. So there was a lot of interesting initiatives during the pandemic that can be built upon and expanded to try and reach the informal workers. So the digital transformation, the pandemic also highlighted the risks of the digital transformation, because basically the pandemic accelerated the digital divide because of the important dislocation across sectors of the economy. You had sectors, like the sectors that could be digital, that gained, and the sectors that couldn't, that really lost during the pandemic. Among the most resilient portions of the economy were the ones, for example, work on digital platforms. But those digital platforms, which have been rising, particularly in advanced economies, call it the gig economy, the homework or the Uber type of work. This is actually a form of informal work that's on the rise. Basically what happens is the workers don't have a contract, don't have a labor contract. They have a contract with the platform based on the task, and they have no rights to any protection or social insurance or anything. And there's an interesting document by the ILO that talks about that, and that's a phenomenon that's recent, but it covers about 5% of workers in Italy and up to 14% of workers in the US. Most importantly, as I said, the pandemic left behind the ones with no digital skills, and that highlighted the importance of having proactive training and upskilling activities to get people up to speed. So what policies can be used to facilitate the transition to the formal economy? So in In the IMF book on informal economy that we published in 2021, we identified basically 4 groups of policies that are most effective. So at the general level, I mean, it's a supply and demand thing. You have to increase both the ability of the economy to absorb the informal, so the economy has to have enough formal jobs. And you also have to increase the ability of individuals and economic units to enter the formal economy. So again, the skills and information issue. So beyond sound macroeconomic policies and better institutions, what we find is there's 4 groups of policies that are most effective. First, education. I mean, I cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, that's the basic. If a country has to decide where to put their money, education is it, and training, lifelong training, skilling, reskilling workers, trying to make sure the students have the skills that the companies demand. The second area of intervention is the tax system, having something simple where people can file easily, only once, if possible, online, where they get a certificate that they've paid their taxes automatically once they pay. Improve coverage of social protection. My colleagues are going to talk about it more later. And then the third group of policies is around financial inclusion. So sub-Saharan Africa has made tremendous strides with very little infrastructure, just relying on mobile phones. And finally, the structural policies, labor market reforms that are so important, particularly in Latin American context, regulatory reforms and improvements in competition policy to make sure the small firms can also enter new sectors. Looking at the role of digitalization, what I mentioned earlier about what APEC did and the initiatives to move towards e-government, Singapore is well advanced, Thailand is well advanced, for example. Let me talk about something that's a more inspirational or aspirational, which is India's effort to move to not just digital government, but a digital society. So what India did, they used digital public infrastructure, which is a set of shared digital building blocks, application systems, platforms powered by interoperable open standards or specification. And what's called the India Stack is the name of a set of DPIs in India, consisting of three basic layers. One is identity. Everyone has an identity number based on biometrics, so it's unique and safe. There's a payments layer, real-time payment system, payment interface that talk to each other. And there's a safe data exchange layer, whereby individuals can choose to have all their personal data, what they buy on Amazon, what they pay for electricity bills to be recorded, and that in turn can be used by banks to provide credit. So let me skip over to the main results and outcomes. So this initiative was a huge help on formalization and more generally inclusive growth in India. They had 8.8 million new payers registered for goods and service tax between 17 and 22, which is very significant. And that was because registering for GST was very quick. They would get their refund almost instantly. And the use of their GST data was shared with banks so they could get trade credits to finance their business. So there was a big incentive for companies to do that. 87% of poor households receive at least one digital transfer during the pandemic. Basically what India did, they consolidated all the benefits using the unique ID and they transferred the money directly to bank accounts. They estimate that they saved about 1% of GDP in more efficiency gains by avoiding in-kind transfers, avoiding corruption that goes in-kind transfers and procurement issues, avoiding sending money twice to the same person. So that was also another big benefit. And on financial inclusion front, 4.5 million individuals and companies benefited from easier access to financial services using the data layer, which was the account aggregator. Think of it as a very fast, nimble, instantaneous credit bureau, credit information system that really brought financial access to a lot of people. So globally, the potential for DPI to boost GDP growth is huge. It's a minimum of 1.5% percentage points of GDP by 2030 in low and middle income countries. Of course, the India experience was not an instantaneous one. It was a long journey. It took decades to set up all the layers. They built on enabling policies from the government. One was to have a very open and competitive telecommunications market. So mobile phones, mobile communications, internet access is easy and cheap, which is not the case in many countries. They had a policy where they pushed a very basic bank accounts to the vulnerable populations. They covered about 500 million people as of 2022. And then there was India's sometimes infamous demonetization policy that was very painful for some, where they eliminated the use of large cash notes, but that forced people to move online for online transactions. The things that are slowing India's progress, of course, are familiar in as in many countries, is the digital divide. So India has very diverse development outcomes across regions, across genders, and across income groups. So the rural people, the women, the poor, the less educated have less access to digital technologies and have less digital skills. The social benefit system in India does not rely on socioeconomic data, so it's not well targeted. This is something that could be added. And India does not have very strong data protection law, which would be important. I mean, there's one in the works right now, but that would be important for this to move forward. But it's a very innovative approach. They've achieved scale, which is very important. I mean, you see really the distinction between successful experiment where you have a formalization initiative for one group of one sector, and reaching scale of a country like India. I think the reason to the success was the approach based on building blocks and open source and standards. So every software solution that was developed was immediately online, available for everyone, and all the systems were interoperable from the beginning. And that was a tremendous part of India's success. So what are the main things I want to leave you with before the other presentations? Maybe three main conclusions. One, so informality is very complex, pervasive, and persistent. It is absolutely inextricably linked to how people grow and develop, so it's very important to address. But the transition will take time because the informal sector is currently the only source of income for millions of people. The second message is, because of its many forms, tackling informality will require coordinated and comprehensive reforms based on a diagnostic of the main drivers of informality. So there's the common ground, and then there's going to be different approaches and different ways of addressing informality depending on the country. It's important to balance both the broad-based horizontal reforms to education, sound macro policies with more targeted intervention, and to also balance enforcement with incentives. I mean, if you think of informal people making a rational cost-benefit analysis, the goal should be to tip the balance towards increasing the benefits of being formal versus informal. And the third lesson is that digitalization can be a very powerful tool to support formalization. This will also take time and by no means will replace the other policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Delasha. I look forward to the discussion we will have during the Q&A. We have one more presentation before the coffee break, and that is Mr. David Kaplan, the lead labour market specialist in Labour Markets and Social Security Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. His presentation is how to design Social Security to promote labour productivity and formality. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everyone so much, first of all, for the invitation, for the opportunity to participate in truly interesting, stimulating events, both today so far and in previous days, and thank everyone for the tremendous hospitality. I hope to justify this better treatment than I deserve by hopefully adding something to the proceedings. So as you can see, I'm going to focus on an area that's a little bit more specific. Informality is a very broad topic, and I'm just going to talk about the design of Social Security and how that could be adapted both to recognize that informality exists, but also be designed to promote formality as much as possible. Before talking about specific design features, we want to talk about the objectives. And of course, there are many objectives, but I just want to focus on two of them. One, we would like Social Security systems to protect all citizens, but with a special focus on people with low income. And again, we're hoping Social Security will promote formal employment in general, but again, particularly in the case of the low-wage workers, low-income people, who are the hardest usually to formalize. Before talking about these policies, I want to try to give some examples of why social protection is often, in our opinion, poorly adapted to the needs of low-wage workers. Oops, there we go. And in particular on this slide, I'm going to focus on the design of old age pension systems, which of course is just one element of Social Security. Later on I'll discuss some broader elements of Social Security. So why are our pension systems often designed in a way that makes them particularly unattractive for low wage workers? I'm going to talk about three features. Let me just add a little bit of defining jargon before I get into this. We're going to talk about contributory pensions. These are the kinds of pensions that you contribute over time, usually linked to your job, and then if you contribute enough, you get a pension at the end. And I'll also talk about what we call non-contributory pensions, which are basically financed through tax revenue. So what are some of the problems? Or why do low-wage workers find it not very attractive to contribute to pension systems? Well, one issue is that in many places, if you contribute to the pension system and get a contributory pension at the end, they may take away your non-contributory pension, which, by the way, depending on the place, may have a fairly similar amount. So in some cases, you may contribute, and congratulations, you get your contributory pension, but then they take away your non-contributory pension, and overall, you've gotten actually not so much out of the deal. This is one issue we want to try to deal with. Another issue, low-wage workers tend to have what we call low contribution densities. That's more jargon. That just means even when low-wage workers participate in the formal sector, they probably don't spend many years there. And why is this such a problem? Because in many places, in order to qualify for a contributory pension, you need to contribute, say, 20 years. You need to be have a formal job for 20 years. If a low-wage worker anticipates not, maybe spending some time in the formal sector, but not reaching this threshold, the formal sector worker and his or her employer will contribute to a pension system, but then not get a pension out at the end. This is one of the issues we want to deal with. And finally, costs. Not just pension costs, but Social Security costs in general, formal employment costs in general. Nobody likes costs, but probably credit-constrained, liquidity-constrained, low-wage workers are the ones who are particularly averse to paying the costs of formal sector employment. So how might we design, and here I'm just talking about the design of old age contributory pensions to sort of adapt to this. Those are the same three problems. I just shrunk the font to be able to link them to possible solutions. And to address the problem of, well, they take away my non-contributory pension if I reach a contributory pension, the simple solution is maybe not do that. Maybe make pensions, non-contributory pensions, really universal or close to universal, separating them, delinking them from the labor market, and besides improving incentives, having a universal pension can help us on the social protection dimension. Now, regarding this problem of a low-wage worker may contribute to the pension system for a while and then not get a contributory pension at the end, what we suggest is reducing vesting periods as much as possible, maybe even eliminating them. Now, what's the idea here? Suppose you only contribute to the pension system for 1 year. Now, obviously, you can't expect to have a tremendously large contributory pension with 1 year of contributions, but what you can expect is a very small contributory pension, which would then be added to the universal pension. So the final pension of someone who contributed only for a year would be the universal pension, plus that little bit that person and his or her employers financed with contributions. If another person contributed for 40 years, obviously the contributory component of the total pension would be much larger. And again, besides improving incentives, this really also improves on the dimension of consumption smoothing. This allows people to, besides the universal pension, at least get a little bit of additional pension, even if the person only contributed for a short period of time. And then this last point is perhaps a bit complicated to explain. The details are in that presentation. I don't know if in that paper or chapter cited at the end. I don't know if the presentations will be shared, but there's a link there. But the idea is we could take advantage of a universal non-contributory pension to improve incentives, especially for low-wage workers, in the following sense. Suppose, I'm just going to make this up, the universal pension gives you about half of what we think a low-wage worker would need for the total pension. Well, we haven't done all the work, but the contributory pension only has to now supply the other half rather than giving the entire pension of this worker. So in rough terms, we could say the contributions, both of the person and his or her employer, could also be reduced by half, improving labor market incentives, especially for low-wage workers. This scheme won't help you very much for pensions of very high-wage workers because the universal pension will probably be very insignificant for them. But for low-wage workers, this partial delinking of the pension, substituting financing with general taxes, the universal pension, for the contributory component, can improve labor market incentives. And I want to give a little bit, now in trouble. There we go. I want to give a little more context on that because we are recommending devoting fiscal resources to universal pensions and other elements of the social protection network. But we also want to be a little bit careful about where we use fiscal resources. And in particular, we tend to think it's a little dangerous, risky, to subsidize contributory Social Security for the following reason. Besides just the fiscal cost in general, we know that the most vulnerable people, on average, tend to not have formal sector jobs. So subsidizing contributory social security, even if you do the best you can within the contributory framework to direct those subsidies to low-wage workers, risks being a regressive subsidy because the lowest wage people tend not to have formal sector jobs at all. So again, what we would propose, and the pensions example is an example of this, taking advantage of universal pillars, universal social security, and work on delinking social security from the labor market. Now, on the previous slide, we talked about how that might be done with pensions. It's much easier, in fact, to say how one might do that with healthcare. Hard to do, but very easy to say. Just finance a healthcare system with general taxes. I don't know if there are any finance people from finance ministries. They would say, well, how are we going to pay that? And that's, of course, an issue. And if anyone is thinking of actually implementing this, there are a million implementation issues. But conceptually, and of course, many places have this, many economies have this, healthcare can be financed entirely with general taxation and not have anything to do at all with the labor market. Let me just make one more comment, sort of transitioning to the future of work with digital technologies and the like. If we think we're headed to a world where it'll be more and more common for people to have part-time work, freelance work, several jobs at the same time, it is very hard to link healthcare to the labor market and handle part-time jobs well. It's very hard to do that, and I know it's easy to say and much harder to do, but if we could separate healthcare from the labor market, that would help a lot. Some additional features now, continuing with the future of work. It can be very tempting to add special regimes. Special regime for rural workers, special regimes, we've seen them for artists. We tend to think the better way to go is to have a well-designed general scheme for Social Security, and as we've been talking about, have that scheme be well adapted for environments with informality and be as attractive as possible for everyone, but especially for low-wage workers, and then essentially apply that general scheme to everybody, including, by the way, independent workers, and I want to describe that a little bit. Partly there's a productivity aspect here. Some people should be entrepreneurs, independent workers, self-employed, but we want the reason to be because that's where they're more productive, or that is more in line with their preferences. We don't want people to choose self-employment because they don't like making pension contributions and they don't have to make pension contributions if they're self-employed. So again, we tend to think we could apply this general scheme essentially to all workers, not just wage workers. And there's another issue. But by the way, you may think I'm saying something beyond what I'm saying. I don't know if that Rappi person is a wage worker or an independent contractor. I'm definitely not taking a stand here right now, but I do want to say the following thing. That's, of course, an important issue a lot of economies are dealing with, how to classify these workers. And that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. But if we lived in a world in which there were no Social Security contributions to finance health care, and if we lived in a world where the pension obligations were the same for independent workers as for wage workers, there would be less on the line when we decide how to classify that person. Not nothing, we still have to make the decision, it's still important, but there would be less on the line. We've at least taken these Social Security concerns off the table. Further recommendation, if we link Social Security to the person rather than the job, we think there are some advantages there, especially in a world where people have multiple jobs and variable income, because essentially, instead of trying to link these things to the job, if we sum up everything you've earned during the year and then decide what Social Security obligations there are, what Social Security payments have already been made, similar to taxation in general, we think that could be a little bit easier. So now, I want to go through not all the details on some of these slides. Let me just say, besides designing a Social Security system with the best possible incentives, that we think is an important issue, improved enforcement, and these are some studies the IDB has been doing. There are, of course, studies done by many organizations, many researchers. We certainly think improved enforcement can be part, an important part, of the overall strategy. And now I want to get, lastly, to the issue of skills, which is, of course, important in its own right, undoubtedly. But what I'm hoping to emphasize here is it's very complementary to these other issues. For example, if we live in a world in which, for other reasons, there are very few formal jobs, it's the formal jobs that are usually demanding the most modern skills. So in some sense, if we try to improve the skills of our population, which of course we should, but on the other hand, there are issues that stop the creation of formal jobs, we're not taking full advantage of the skills of our workers. And by the way, just the opposite would occur. If we managed to create a whole bunch of new, if we had an environment more conducive to the creation of formal employment, the very next question, without a doubt, of the firm owners would be, where am I going to find the workers with the right skills? So all I wanted to say here is, not only is skills important, that's probably not a message that would surprise you very much, but it's very intimately related to these other issues. It's hard to think of the skills agenda without thinking, where are these people going to work? And that leads to regulations and the design of Social Security. And it's hard to think of measures to create more formal jobs without thinking, where are firms going to find the right workers to fill them? So again, skill is important in its own right, without a doubt, and it's so intimately tied to these other issues, it's hard to think of them separately. And with that, I just want to conclude. The design we have in mind of Social Security to promote labor productivity, labor formality, is fundamentally designed based on delinking, separating Social Security as much as is possible. 100% is probably not possible, but as much as is possible, separating Social Security from the labor market. And again, instead of special regimes for different groups, trying to have one general regime as well designed as possible to promote formality, again, and especially thinking of low-wage workers. And again, part of this having one general scheme would be treating wage workers as similarly as possible to independent workers regarding their Social Security obligations. Not everything, but regarding their Social Security obligations. Of course, complementing with enforcement and recognizing that even the best economic environment, the best designed system to create formal jobs is not going to work well if we don't have workers with the right skills to fill those jobs. Again, I hope I added something to the proceedings. With that, I will thank you so much and turn it over back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Kaplan. We will now have a quick coffee break for 10 minutes before moving on to the last speakers. So we'll resume our discussion at 10:50. See you back in here. Thank you. No?
No, don't go.
That's not, it's,
Huh?
Sorry.
Oh, no, I don't.
Are we moving on to questions? Okay. Apparently we're having some questions, so sorry. We'll have a coffee break in a minute. Thank you.
It's not on.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Yes, few questions before the coffee break. And good morning to our very good friend, Executive Director, Dr. Rebecca, and all our fellow colleagues. This is all about that we have been working for 3 years. We finally want to have a really close dialogue with you on why it's relevant to have this topic as a permanent topic now in APEC. The idea of this policy dialogue is that you have received during the more than 2 weeks ago a draft of key elements table that could serve as a tool to develop a draft zero of a possible roadmap to promote a transition to the formal economy. I will start with Corinne. I would like to ask you, maybe you can share with our fellow economists, why reducing informality is a must for sustainable and inclusive growth?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that was the goal of my presentation.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to repeat, but again, you know, the key messages stand. Informality is a big part of APEC economies, even in advanced economies. It's not going away on its own. It's very persistent. So it will require specific interventions to address. So that's one. The second point is that informality is an obstacle to inclusive growth in a sense that it comes with low productivity, high poverty, inequality, and below potential tax collection and public service collection. So it's a must. If you think about societies that have to address declining productivity trends, aging trends, increasing, you know, the potential by bringing the informal people in the formal sector is the only way to go. And then the final thought is it covers many areas. The areas will be different depending on the country, depending on what drives informality in each country, but they will require a deliberate and intentional coordinated strategy across government, not just one entity or not one policy, to tackle different aspects and basically bring, as David was mentioning and I was mentioning, not only the supply of formal jobs up, but also the demand for those formal jobs up with sufficiently qualified and trained workers. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very good. I asked you this to highlight this because in year 2021, when I brought this topic, we were drafting the implementation plan of the Putrajaya vision, and I remember New Zealand asked me, you have to combine all the 19 economies. So I had the job to talk to each of our senior officials, and at the beginning it was a big challenge, but now listening to you on why this is also very relevant to promote inclusive economic and social growth, which is a topic we have been in APEC for a while, this topic is relevant. So thank you, Corinne, for that. David, and you said that having a well-designed social scheme for workers, including by independent works, is important. How do you think economies could do that?
It's a tough question. It's both an easy question to answer, but it's a tough one because I'm aware of the political difficulties. I'm aware, for example, that some of the economies, and I have sort of a blind spot for Latin America and the Caribbean, that's where I pay most attention, but some of the economies in the region I look at have made efforts to incorporate in a mandatory fashion independent workers, and there have been complaints. There have been, maybe they've delayed the implementation, trying to reach a consensus. But on purely technical grounds, I would say the following things. First of all, as far as I know, independent workers age at exactly the same rate as us wage workers. We're all heading towards old age, or the alternative is even worse. So pensions are just as important for independent workers as they are for wage workers. We all get sick. We all have various problems. That's one. Another thing, when you look at people's labor trajectories, perhaps it's not the best way to say some people are wage workers, some people are independent workers. Perhaps it's best to say people are wage workers today, but they might be independent workers in a year, they might come back. So if we're hoping that people can contribute enough over their lifetime, including employer contributions to finance a reasonable pension, if you practically say they won't be contributing while they're independent workers, it's going to be very difficult. Now, I would also add that a big part of this is human beings are not entirely rational. I, for example, can calculate compound interest with the best of them. I understand about the magic of compound interest, but what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the weekend. And by the way, I'm 52, so I'm not even that far. But it is hard for human beings to think enough about the future. And efforts to promote voluntary savings are very important. But human beings, we have found, if you don't sort of twist their arms, if you don't force them, will probably not save enough on their own. And then finally, I want to mention this productivity aspect. When we study productivity, we notice that there are firms with very different levels of productivities that coexist. And I'm going to overly simplify some of the diagnostics, but in general, we find that firms that hire wage workers are more productive, on average, than firms that don't have wage workers. So a firm owned by one person or that has just contractual relations, so it doesn't have wage workers. Apparently, there are many cases in which people take jobs not as wage workers when they would, even though they would be more productive. And there are probably many reasons for, I'm quite sure there are several reasons for that. But I suspect one of the reasons is, in some countries, maybe I'd be more productive as a wage worker, but now I'm going to use an abuse of terminology on purpose. I have to pay pension taxes if I'm a wage worker. I know we're not supposed to call them taxes, but I think people often interpret them as taxes. That's why I'm abusing the terminology. So maybe I'll take a job as an independent worker, even when I'd be more productive as a wage worker. And especially, again, in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean that I know the best, we cannot afford to not advance as much as possible on the productivity agenda. So I think forcing, and I know that sounds terrible, independent workers to contribute to Social Security would be a pro-productivity move as well.
Thank you very much. As this dialogue is on understanding the nexus between digital connectivity and formalization, Corinne, you mentioned the Indian successful case of formalization by using digitalization. when using digitalization for greater formalization, where economists should put emphasis, or what kind of risk should be taken into account?
Well, that's a big topic, and so the caveat is it's a big topic, and I'm not an expert. I think there's various things, starting with the basic preconditions: electricity, affordable mobile telecommunications, affordable internet. So there's a whole part of infrastructure that governments can facilitate by promoting open and competitive telecoms market. So that would be one. Then there's a whole aspect, as I said, of education and training. So ICT type of education, bringing people, students, giving students the right skills to interact in the digital age. So those are the basic enabling conditions that governments should promote. Beyond that, there can be initiatives to help digitalization and formalization, but they should always be coordinated. So if you want to have digital tax payments, you can also link that with digital social transfers. So make sure the government is not siloed in this approach, so you don't have one system for taxes, one system for social security, and another system, and then systems that don't talk to each other. So I think being deliberate about e-government as a whole is helpful. But there's a whole part where you need to work with the private sector, and then that's what made India's example so powerful. They rely, again, entirely on open source systems that were interoperable, and that was the big strength of that. There's a danger of a government having different digitalization initiatives that are not part of a strategy, and that would not really help the goal. I mean, they could help some of the way, some of the time, but not be sufficient, I think.
Thank you, Corinne. That's very interesting. David, finally, before the break, do you think that by promoting a tax or taxation reform that reduce regulatory burdens and increase digitalization of tax administration, economies could maybe engage the informal sector?
I certainly think digitalization offers certain opportunities. And the question is, will we be able to take advantage of them? And maybe I want to give one concrete example. When I, to work at a university, arrived in Mexico City in 2000, I used to take taxis from these stands. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure they were informal. I doubt that they were reporting their income anywhere. And it occurs to me, suppose there would be an attempt to formalize them. It would have been very difficult. How would you even know where they are? Now, maybe there's probably some licensing involved, although, not always, but there certainly wasn't a digital trail of their activities. So maybe, on the other hand, last night I took an Uber to go buy some gifts so that, I'm well received, or at least, not too terribly received when I get home. Similar activity, I think, but there is a digital trail of that transaction. Now, I'm not sure. I'm going to guess that person, I don't know. What I would say is at least the opportunity to observe that income to make sure that income is brought into the taxation. And again, I believe Peru is an economy where, assuming we classify the Uber driver as an independent contractor, there's no obligation to contribute to Social Security. But if there were, there would also be a digital trail for those purposes. So I know there are risks, absolutely, but I also think there are these opportunities, and I think policymakers should do their best to take advantage of these opportunities.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that discussion. We will now break for coffee and be back in 10 minutes, so 11:05. Thank you. that? That's the hummingbird on your lapel. It's nice. That is a good hummingbird. Oh my god, I gotta get one. But my lapels are always so small. I don't think one that size would fit on it, but that is great. I like that. It's smart. When you see it, I want to buy one of those hats. Everyone, we will be commencing the next session shortly. If you could please take your seats. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good coffee break. The next topic is structural reform for digital connectivity and formalisation. Please welcome to the podium Mr. Rory McLeod, Economic Policy Consultant and former APEC Economic Committee Chair. Rory.
I've got some slides, I'm hoping. Oh, good, thank you. Hello everyone. I'm certainly not an expert on formalisation, and so I'm going to be telling you today a very personal story about my journey about learning about formalisation, because I was that person at the other end of the line when Renato in 2021 said, we want formalisation to be part of the Aotearoa Plan of Action. And I must say that at that stage, our reaction was, what's this? So we had a little chat amongst ourselves and we said, we'll just tell him that he has to get the support of all the other APEC economies, and he'll never get that, so we'll just relax. So we told Renato that, and well, as we say in New Zealand, blow me down, he got that support. So we put it in. But we didn't really know what it meant in true APEC tradition. And then, continuing my journey on learning about this, last year I had the privilege to be part of US SEGA capacity building efforts for Peruvian colleagues that are involved in hosting this year. And I had the real pleasure of talking a lot about the formalisation priority that Peru was seeking to propose for its host year. And I suddenly realised that the person whose capacity was being built the most was my own, because the fact was that this was taking a whole sort of lens off of me. Then finally, Renato asked me to speak at this event, and I was frankly horrified because I know nothing about I was only just starting to learn about formalisation, and he said, well, just take it and adopt a structural reform lens. And I said, oh, well, I can probably do that. So the first thing I thought was in terms of the digital economy and formalisation, do we have any previous examples in APEC of this, and I thought, yes, there's a very good one. And that happened in 2018, where we had, actually in that stage I was working with Papua New Guinea and its hosting year, and its priority was around digitalization. And the Papua New Guinean team found a very impressive young woman entrepreneur called Crystal Kewe, who had a digital startup in Papua New Guinea. So she came and spoke at some APEC events, and then she entered the APEC App Challenge, and she won. And she had developed an app that allowed Papua New Guinean women who made these string bags called billums. For those of you who did the Papua New Guinea year, you'll remember them because they were given to us as presents. But they are these remarkable bags that are sold at markets by people that were involved in, artisans involved in handicrafts, etc. And they are very much sort of a cultural symbol with deep meaning for each of the cultures involved making these bags. And they were very popular items because you could go to markets and buy them, relatively inexpensively, sort of $10 or $15 at most, US, and they were, great presents to take home. But really, these people were underselling themselves. They're in the informal economy, they're selling at markets, but this app that Crystal developed allowed these things to be platformed onto the digital environment, and suddenly they increased the sale price of the items by a factor of 20, and it transformed the makers of these bags from the status of artisans to the status of artists, because that's what they were. They are highly creative people, the creative hub of these cultures, and the digital technologies allowed these artists to enter the formal economy and to actually sell their products in a way that it had much more integrity for the product than selling them in markets, because essentially they are the story of these people's cultures. So, so I thought that's a great example of what can happen through, formalization through digital technologies. Anyhow, to get back to the boring stuff, in terms of a structural reform person, the first thing I needed to look at was, how innovative are businesses in the informal economy. And my reading showed me that they're actually highly innovative. They're involved in constraint-based innovation that is often based on survival, scarcity, and the needs of less affluent customers. You've got to be innovative to survive in those circumstances. They don't really use formal ID, but they adopt and adapt, incremental rather than radical innovations, often adapting technologies that are used in the formal sector. And we've all seen them, the lawnmower engines that are taken to make actual transport vehicles, very cheap transport vehicles in rural areas and things like that. The innovations take place in geographically concentrated regions and in a collaborative manner, and they spread very quickly because they're unencumbered by inconvenient institutions like intellectual property rights, things like that. So I thought, cool. So how do we unlock this innovation and actually, take it from this small local context to a much wider context in the formal economy, where you can see, the kind of unrealized potential of these people come to the fore? I thought, surely, APEC processes such as trade liberalization, structural reform, digitalization are the answer. And so then I read about that and I found out that no. Actually, there's a lot of evidence, not always the case, but there's a lot of evidence that these processes actually increase the size of the informal economy rather than decrease it. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. if you're in a situation without the other preconditions, which I'll come to in a moment, and you have a lot more cheap, efficiently made products in your marketplace, it's likely that you are forced to retreat to the informal sector because you aren't competing any longer. Digitalization increases the opportunities for informalization, and this is a particular factor in developed economies, as we heard earlier. And this is a problem because the people concerned lose their access to social safety nets, the consumers of their products lose their access to consumer guarantees, and of course governments lose their access to the revenue base provided by taxation from these businesses. So I start to see this was just as much a developed economy issue as a developing economy issue. Another interesting factor I saw just from reading is that, when you have a large and growing informal sector, it actually becomes much more difficult for formal firms in your economy to access finance. There's too much uncertainty for the banks lending to these formal firms to know what the competition from the informal sector means, and so they do less well than when the formal sector is larger. So this is the bit where you're going to have heard it. Oh, sorry. Right. This is the bit where you're going to have heard it all before. What's needed to ensure that actors in the informal sector have the incentives to move to the formal sector and therefore improve their lives? Well, it seems that this is where the structural reform lens comes in. It seems the most important thing is resilient market institutions, and particularly the rule of law in the interests of those in the informal sector. If the rule of law is not operating, so that the people in the informal sector can get justice in whatever context, it's very difficult for them to enter. This is very much Professor De Soto's, your formal sector economy has to be working properly if you want to do well for the informal sector. There's the other things that you've heard already: labour market reforms, education and healthcare, expanded coverage of digital technologies, and light and simple taxation regimes. Getting the formal sector working properly so that it provides incentives for entry by firms and individuals from the informal sector. Sorry. The digital technologies, that's the part we were talking about here, these provide the potential for leapfrogging. We only have a short time, so I'm just going to give a couple of quick examples because One example is APEX Ease of Doing Business Work Program. So the Ease of Doing Business Work Program run by the Economic Committee is based pretty well entirely on digital technologies and on simplifying the processes involved. These apply to such key things for the informal sector as starting a business, access to credit, enforcing contracts. If you get these things right, the informal sector suddenly starts to want to be part of the formal sector. The thing about the Ease of Doing Business Work Program is that it significantly simplifies the processes involved. Say if you're starting a company, you might be moving from 14 steps that take 3 months to 2 steps which can be accomplished overnight. So there's huge simplification of the processes. We found that as member economies undertook these processes, they made big gains. For example, Papua New Guinea reformed its credit legislation to greatly simplify access to credit. It moved 20% in the global Ease of Doing Business results rankings as a result of that one reform. So the fact is that this has huge benefits. But the one that we didn't realized as we're doing the program was that it has huge benefits about lowering levels of corruption. Because the fact is that when you digitize these processes, you put them online, they're transparent, there's 2 processes rather than 12 in, say, starting a business, 2 steps. That cuts out 10 steps where there's the potential for a corrupt transaction to take place. And those 2 steps are online, there's often not a person involved, they're transparent, so you can really improve the integrity of the remaining 2 steps. And we actually saw evidence that levels of corruption lowered dramatically with the ease of doing business work programs that were on the net. And to me, that lowering of corruption is really important in terms of facilitating entry of informal businesses. Second, sorry, the slides are in landscape, but they come out in portrait here. The second example is that digital technology is really important in the formal sector if we're going to promote formalization. The fact is that if we have structural reform of digital industries so that the costs are lowered, there's improvement and simplification of services, and there's significant expansion of networks, the ability of informal firms to participate formally in the economy increases as well. And you see this even in telecommunications is particularly important, but you see it even in sectors such as banking, transport, and energy. So this is absolutely critical to the kind of what Professor De Soto was saying as sort of improving the formal economy. So the other thing that Peru has convinced me of is that APEC is a great organization to work on this issue. We are an organization that we do our best when we're involved in exploration, when we're all learning from each other, and where we're basically fulfilling that role of incubator of ideas. And the fact is that pretty well every part of APEC's system has a role to play. I put the EC at the top, of course. That's dealing with competition policy, regulatory reform, ease of doing business, CTI on trade facilitation, a few other minor things. All the working groups have an element of this. There would not be a working group that you would find that would not be relevant to small business. And then finance ministers, really interested in this because they want their tax. But actually access to credit is a big issue for them as well. So so I think that all parts of APEC can be involved in this, and so is formalization the missing element of APEC's inclusion agenda? Well, these ladies think that question is funny. Because to them it's pretty obvious, I think. And actually, I think we have women, really important. Small businesses, really important. And then we kind of stop. I mean, we have Indigenous people. I know that we have that. But the 2 biggies have been women and small businesses. There always seems to be something missing to me. I think formalization provides that missing element. And I think APEC is... the other thing I really like about this is that it's not subject to big power tensions or clash of frameworks. We're all just learning. So I think it's a really ideal issue for APEC to get stuck into. So I congratulate Renato on the journey he's taking me on. Please don't take me on too many more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for your insights. Now let's turn our attention to the next presentation, Formalisation of Informal Entrepreneurs in Malaysia. Joining us to shed light on this topic is Ms. Zoradaya Bintay Mohammed Saeed, Senior Principal Assistant Secretary in the Policy and International Relations Division at the Ministry of Entrepreneur Development and Cooperatives of Malaysia. I welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And very good morning to the fellow panelists and members of the senior officials at the SCE, Policy Dialogue Understanding, the nexus between digital connectivity and formalization in the Asia Pacific. My topic of presentation today will cover on Malaysia's experience on how we formulate the policies and plan relating to the formalization of informal entrepreneurs in Malaysia. My presentation also will cover some of the topics related to the informal entrepreneurships. Okay. In defining informal entrepreneurship, it is a subset of a larger ecosystem, which is the informal sector. For Malaysia, we adopt the definition by the ILO, of which the informal sector in Malaysia is defined as an informal enterprise that meets the following criteria, namely the first, the enterprise must not be registered in any of registration body because in Malaysia, the most important registration body for business is Companies Commission of Malaysia, or SSM, or any professional bodies, including local authorities, because in doing business in Malaysia, you not only have to register business, but you have to comply with some of the licensing conditions, requirements. For example, according to the local authority, when you want to operate some business in some of the locality, you have to attain some of the licenses from that particular local authorities. And the second one, the informal sector, the enterprise must engage in producing goods and services for sales and or barter transaction. There must be transaction between the enterprise activities, and the third criteria is the number of employees for the enterprise in the informal sector is less than 10 people, and these workers are also not protected in any national legislation on and in the specific form of national legislation. The informal sector in Malaysia also does not take into account the informal jobs in the formal sector, and also based on the conceptual framework of informal employment, the employment in agriculture-related sectors also are not take into account under the informal sector in Malaysia. There are 4 key actors in the informal sector. There are unpaid family workers, employees, employers, and own account workers. For the definition of informal entrepreneurs in Malaysia, we regard employers and own account workers as informal entrepreneurs. It's constitute about 73.4%. And the other 2 unpaid family workers and employees, although they are belonging to the informal sector, we don't regard these 2 groups as informal entrepreneurs, but they are involved in the activities under the informal sectors. The informal sector in Malaysia tends to be prevalent due to the growing numbers of people involving or participating in the gig economy, especially during the pandemic COVID-19, where the digitalization has accelerated and changed how people do the daily routine, as well as the increasing of the informal sector in Malaysia also due to the accessibility to virtual platforms, particularly within the rural areas. It affects some of the landscape of the informal sector in Malaysia, where based on the demographic highlights, 73.7% of total informal sector employment are made of urban population. This is the impact of digitalization. And 67% is concentrated in the service sector. This is normally the biggest chunk of sector activity involved, especially for micro entrepreneurs, mainly in the wholesale and retail trade, F&B and accommodation, as well as transformation and storage. And the informal sector employment is also dominated by male in Malaysia, middle-aged population, and those with formal education up to the secondary level. And a total of 37.1% of informal sector in Malaysia is driven by the comfort of working from home, whereby we regard them as informal home-based entrepreneurs. In Malaysia, we categorize informal entrepreneurs into 5 categories, where we position them within the 2 main spectrum that are limited capability to register, and the second one, lack of drive to register. This is important for the policymakers to really understand the nature of informal entrepreneurs before we formulate any plan for their transition to the formal economy. The first category of informal entrepreneurs are naturally informal. This involves people who has run a business, a very small scale business, driven by necessity, just to make living. And some of the entrepreneurs, this type of naturally entrepreneurs, are exempted by law under Registration of Business Act. For example, door-to-door salesmen, tailor or craftsmen who do not commercially advertise their services to the public. The second category for informal entrepreneurs in Malaysia is experimental informal entrepreneurs. It involves people who has the business where it's still at the trial phase. Normally, they will involve very innovative business model, but yet registration is not their priority because they are still at the trial level. This involves the startup, mainly for the startups in incubation center. The third informal entrepreneurs categories are seasonal informal entrepreneurs. This type of entrepreneurs, they operate a business in a particular season or period where they are temporarily and typically do the business as a side income. As you all know, Malaysia also has a lot of seasonal fruits. And this type of farmers who has produced seasonal fruit will become temporary seasonal sellers during that particular time. And also during particular season, there are also small businesses conduct business within that particular time of festive season. The fourth category of informal entrepreneurs is uninformed, which is they have no sufficient knowledge on business registration and its benefits due to the social factor or geographical structure. Normally, it is involved the entrepreneurs who inherit family business, the small family business. Normally, they want to upscale, they want to grow bigger, so that they seek for more assistance from the government or from the agencies under the government, and they don't know where to go to register the business, but they are willingly to comply with. And the fifth category is opportunistic informal entrepreneurs. This is very unknown to the government because they deliberately not registering the business to avoid paying taxes and also other compliance costs. They just want to maintain very small business activities by not disclosing their existence to the public. Informal entrepreneurs often face significant barriers when attempting to formalize their businesses. And from Malaysian context, the issues and challenges related to informal entrepreneurs are still working within the 2 main spectrums, limited capability to register and lack of drive to register. First, challenges is lack of foresight due to the biased way of thinking and attitude toward risk, as also lack of knowledge in business strategy and lack of business resources and means. The second challenges forms within the lack of encouragement and motivation within the entrepreneurs. Due to the complexity of regulation, they perceive that the regulation and registration process is difficult to comply with. They have insufficient knowledge about the benefits of formalization and the perception of legal burdens and loss of personal benefits. The third categories of issues and challenges related to Malaysian landscape of informal entrepreneurs is limited support and facilitation to grow the business. why formalization is important for Malaysia? Because Malaysia has greatly learned from the pandemic COVID-19 experience, where micro and informal enterprises are the most impacted due to their vulnerable status. They are not registered. They are unknown to the government because the government has no track record where they are, but they are the most suffered one during the pandemic. And also with the change of the employment landscape during the pandemic, with the movement of control order, many people has lost jobs and they turn to informal business just to survive. And some of them go to the gig, some of the gig works as a freelancers, just to continue living during the pandemic, COVID-19. So we see that this is important for the government to track them, to make them visible to us, so that we can channel the assistance accordingly to this group, because there has no registered ID, no particular database on informal entrepreneurs in Malaysia for reference, so that this is the time for us to start off in properly structured them in the transition plan for formalization. So the formalization is important for us because there is a potential increase in number of new entrepreneurs, because to increase their visibility to the government assistance. The second is to provide legislation and social protection. With formalization, they will have these two coverage of these requirements. And third is to minimize the issues of non-compliance. Of course, it's about a matter of enforcement. And fourth, promoting conducive ecosystem, and eternally with the formalization, it will increase the contribution of our MSMEs to the national GDP. As we forward to address the formalization issues effectively, the Government of Malaysia has launched the formalization plan for informal entrepreneurs in 2023 to facilitate transition of informal entrepreneurs towards becoming registered business and further contribute to the development of entrepreneurship in Malaysia. With the theme of formalization as a basis of sustainable business, because sustainability is also the main agenda on for the MSMEs development, the formalization plans aims in making registration the norm for businesses in Malaysia. So the implementation of this plan is guided by 5 principles, of which it identifies based on the root cause and issues of and challenges faced by the informal entrepreneurs, just like I mentioned earlier. The first guiding principle, the intervention must be targeted, tailored to the different informal entrepreneurs categories based on their needs and motivation. And the strategies and initiatives must cover the holistic development of entrepreneurs aspect. And the strategies also must strike the balance between the provision of incentive and enforcement. It's a matter of carrot and stick. And also the strategies leverage on the availabilities of the technologies, how the technologies can help in transition of informal to the formal entrepreneurs. And also the implementation of the strategies must be collectively done by the government, not only the public agencies, but as well as the private institution. Because we want to achieve the 3 main objectives under this plan. First is we want to build a very cohesive and conducive entrepreneurship ecosystem to encourage business formalization easily, voluntarily, without enforcing them to register the business. The second one is to produce a very ethical and high integrity entrepreneurs. When digitalization came, the issues of trust, issue of the scammers and all that comes in. So that is important for the government to encourage more formalization, so that the rights of the consumer, the rights of the people, the rights of the business owner as well can be protected. And the third key objectives of this plan is to produce better social protection for business owners and also as its employees. The 6 strategies formulated under this plan covers end-to-end facilitation for formalization transition. We start with very small initiatives under the first strategy, which focusing on the enhancing awareness and enable effective communication for business formalization. we currently has conducted with collaboration by Companies Commission Malaysia, SSM, and other ministries, especially my ministries of entrepreneurs and cooperative development, to provide mobile registration counter across the nation. We also provide online and offline one-stop shop. With reference to My Biz portal, this is very challenging because we have to streamline all the sources of registration, business registration and licensing in one platform. It's not easy to encourage them to be on board on one platform, and we are at the stage of enhancing this portal to make sure it can be one-stop shop for the entrepreneurs. And also we will launch this year the official handbook offline, because some of them still need very hard copy reference for them as a reference to business registration and licensing. And the second strategy, we move step ahead to increase facilitation in the business formalization process. With this, Malaysia has encouraged and promote collaboration with business association and industries to facilitate, especially the members of the organization, because entrepreneurs in Malaysia are quite close with the association. So the association will help them to register the business so that they can be operate as formal business. And also, we tackle these issues through education and training, because the module of business registration and licensing is embedded in the existing entrepreneurship development program as well as entrepreneurship training. For example, in higher education, we have 2 credits module on fundamental of entrepreneurship. So the subject of business registration is already in, so that if the student graduate and want to become the business or become entrepreneurs, they have some sort of knowledge earlier to facilitate them for the business formalization process. The strategy 3 focusing on initiative for incentivization of business formalization. Currently, we provide some sort of assistance for those who just register the business to channel them with what they need. For example, if they need some sort of the training in terms of their capacity building, we will channel that particular entrepreneurs to very specific programs related to the requirement, as well as if they need business matching, for example, they need partners for their business. So under the My Assist MSME SME platform, they will do some sort of the virtual business matching. Also, we have the physical business matching to help these new entrepreneurs to get the assistance to incentivize from their business formalization. The strategy 4 are focusing more on the boosting the capability and competence of informal entrepreneurs, meaning that before they turn from informal to formal, they may need some of the assistance. For example, they want to kick off one of the entrepreneurship project, very small project to kick off. So our agencies like Tekun National, and there is one agency very specific for micro and nano entrepreneur, Amanah Ikhtiar Malaysia. They provide microcredit facilities to the informal, but with very minimum amount, Ringgit Malaysia 5,000, for example. But if we want to upscale the business, upscale the entrepreneurship project and turn it to the more formal, they have to fulfill the requirement to register so that they will get bigger amount for the microcredit facilities. That's one of the example how we try to boost the capacity and capability of the informal entrepreneurs to business formalization. And 5th strategy are focusing on provision of supportive legislation and enforcement for business formalization. One of the category mentioned earlier is seasonal informal entrepreneurs. So with this, for this type of informal entrepreneurs, the local authorities or any authoritative body will offer special license for this type of entrepreneurs to conduct business within the specified season. If they want to go beyond that period, they have to comply with the Companies Commission business registration as usual. And the 6th strategy will strengthen the governance and monitoring system for business formation. We refer back to what we experienced during the pandemic. we don't have very solid database for informal, micro and informal entrepreneurs. It's fragmented and unknown to the government. So it's timely for us to develop one special database for micro so that we can track how many informal has been successfully formalized under this plan. Also, we established action committee for monitoring and evaluation to look into the programs conducted by more than 60 agencies in Malaysia. There are more than 60 agencies doing entrepreneurship development. So we can we can achieve the target to ensure that the informal can transit to the formal economy. So, in conclusion, before I end my presentation, the conclusion, we can conclude that informal entrepreneurship in Malaysia has significant potential in contributing to the GDP's, economy's GDP and employment. And also, informal entrepreneurs often face myriads of challenge to formalize their business. So with this formalization plan for informal entrepreneurs, it provides a whole of government approach and multi-stakeholder approach to create a cohesive and facilitative entrepreneurship ecosystem for business formalization. And to relate with today's theme, digital connectivity, yes, it plays significant role towards formalization, but it also needs to be supported by the other provision like fiscal and non-fiscal support based on the needs of the informal entrepreneurs at the ground so that it can help them towards their transition for formalization. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zoraida. I found that very interesting, and I also think you get the prize for the best PowerPoint presentation because that was perfectly set out. We will now turn our attention to the virtual presentation from Mr. Norman Loyaza, Director of the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank. He will present on formalization. Digitalization can empower but not replace a better business environment. Is Norman available?
Hello, good morning.
Hello, yes, we can see you.
All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Special thanks to the APEC Secretariat and to Mr. Reyes Tagle. It's an opportunity to be with you, although I do miss being in Lima to interact directly with you. I am listening to some echo, so I wonder if it can be prevented from your side. Thank you. Okay, so I am, as the moderator said, director of the Global Indicators Group, and we produce some of the flagship reports of the World Bank. One of them is Women, Business and the Law, and another is Enterprise Surveys. And the third, but not least, is Business Ready, which is the successor to Doing Business. I have heard some of the speakers refer to this project, so I am very keen to see how this can actually help out. Thank you. So let me then start my presentation. And you can see by the title where the message that I am trying to present to you, that digitalization is important to empower formalization, but it cannot replace a better business environment. As you well know, informality is widespread in developing economies. Indeed, it is one of the most formidable challenges. According to our calculations, developing economies have about 2/3 of the labor force in the informal sector. There are some variations across regions, which you can see in this PowerPoint slide. In fact, if we compare the proportion of informal workers to how much they produce, we can see that there is a wide difference in productivity. 2/3 of workers are employed in the informal sector, but they produce about 1/3 of GDP. What that implies is that there are indeed massive gains of formalization. So this is the situation that we have in the developing world, where about 2/3 of employment is informal. And if we were to move to a world where the ratios are reversed, so that formal employment will be about 2/3, then GDP per worker would increase in a magnitude of around 70%. So the gains of formalization, if you just look at the issue from the perspective of productivity and the increase in GDP per worker, is massive. Well, this is something that we know. Therefore, the question is how we can formalize. And we have heard several presentations today that are very informative as to the process of formalization. The question that we want to address today, however, is more specific. And this is about the role of digitalization. But let's go back to the main conclusion on addressing informality. The main conclusion is that the governments, policymakers, must make formality attractive. And this can be done through basically two components. One is by reducing the cost of becoming and remaining formal, and the other is by improving the benefits of being formal. And indeed, digitalization can help formality attractive. We have several mechanisms that are presented here in the slide. The first mechanism is by providing information even to the faraway places. And the use of digital technologies can reduce transaction costs. If you have more information to more people and lower transaction costs, this is going to promote competition in a way that is transparent and fair for more entrepreneurs. This is on the benefit side. Uh, on the side of leveling the cost of formality, we see that digitalization can also facilitate enforcement of regulations on both formal and informal enterprises. A common complaint that we hear from formal firms is that they are subject to all types of fiscalization measures, enforcement measures, but informal enterprises are not. Well, digitalization can help identify these informal enterprises and enforce regulations on them as well. This is, in a summary, how digitalization can help informality be more attractive. But digitalization cannot operate miracles. In fact, digitalization can be effective only when the business environment is favorable. And let me give you 3 examples taken from areas that businesses have to deal with almost on a regular basis. First example will deal with business entry, the second with taxation, and the third with dispute resolution. But of course, we can have many more examples where we would find basically the same pattern. Let me start with business entry. The popularity of online one-stop shops is now worldwide, and it is clear to see the advantages of having such mechanism. Registration can be done easily, information can be obtained likewise, and you can also use these one-stop shops for payments and even for compliance checks. But if the regulatory framework is still too heavy in other respects, for instance, if labor markets are excessively regulated, firms will still not register. They would prefer to remain outside of the formal sector. The second example has to do with taxation. And here we have the good practice of a digital portal. And it has several components, some of which are being highlighted in the slide, such as the e-filing of tax returns or even digital payment options. But if tax rates are too high and taxation is complicated, you can see that firms will still try to avoid and evade paying taxes. The third example has to do with dispute resolution and the emergence of e-courts. Now, these e-courts offer different features, all of them very valuable indeed. For instance, the litigation can take place virtually. The payments can also be done in a digital manner, and the filing of documents, which used to be a nightmare in the analog fashion of the analog world, with hundreds of paper being in file cabinets, now this can be done online. But, and there is always a but here, if the judicial system is arbitrary and unpredictable, firms will not use formal courts or out-of-court mechanisms. They would just be afraid of presenting their cases towards a formal court, even if they have e-courts as a benefit. So what is needed is a comprehensive business environment reforms that can address the major obstacles. Some of them have been identified here, like a rigid labor market, cumbersome entry and exit, the inexistent or confusing land rights, excessive and complicated taxes, and constraints on financial markets. The point is that digitalization can indeed be a facilitator. It will not remove completely these obstacles. These obstacles must be removed, but digitalization can help. I told you at the beginning of my presentation that my group is in charge of producing the successor to doing business. This is called now Business Ready, and the first report will be launched in September of this year. It has been prepared in the last couple of years. Well, this is the approach that I have been presenting to you is exactly the one that we take in the new Business Ready project. That digitalization is effective only when the business environment is appropriate. In this project, Business Ready, we actually look at the life cycle of the firm, opening, operating, expanding, and closing, or restarting a business. And we consider 10 different areas. You can see them here on the slide, but you will be very familiar with the fact that they are critically important to firms that are operating. And the approach that we take is such that digitalization is a cross-topic subject. We emphasize the importance of providing public services that are based on digital technologies so that the regulatory framework can be more propitious and that formality can be more attractive to firms. And with this, I thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Loiza, for your insights. The moderator, senior official Ray Taglis, will now ask our panelists some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you very much. I just make one question to each of you in order to start what is the goal of this policy dialogue? That is that senior officials from the 21 economies and also their delegations could also make comments or also ask some questions to all of you. Rory, what kind of competitiveness policy reform economies should develop to promote engagement of informal sector in markets, in your opinion?
So to tell you the truth, I think the most important competition policy reform is in the formal sector, and it's really lowering barriers to entry into telecommunications and digital markets. Because once those barriers to entry are down, it allows for a flourishing of innovation and the provision of products that are very tailored to much smaller, more small-scale businesses that allows those businesses to enter into the formal economy. So that's why we've seen in so many of our economies still, and developed as well as developing, that telecommunications, broadcasting markets, digital markets are still very path dependent. They're still run on very traditional lines, and so you provide the same set of products that you've always provided, and those products are not suitable for the informal, economy. So that's why I think that's where the competition policy reform is most important.
Thank you, Rory. It's a very, very important point. And the key areas table that we have shared with the economists also include as one of the key area understanding informal actor challenges. And Ms. Suraida, what is the Malaysian methodology to get to know or understand the informal sector in your economy?
Okay. Under the formalization plan, we conduct some sort of the early study. There are two studies actually. First, we conduct the behavioral insight study, where we want to understand more our informal entrepreneurs, especially under the informal sector, what is actually they want to achieve for the business activities, so that it's easier for us to understand their the insight of their behavior. When we put some of the carrot, what is the reaction, and we put some of the deterrents like the stick for enforcement, for example, what is the reaction from the informal entrepreneurs? Definitely, the carrot will win during the behavioral insight study. But for the government, we don't have enough resources. Yeah, very large resources needed if we want to formalize all the informal entrepreneurs. But we also don't have one size fit for all approach. So that we use apply for the more targeted approach. So that from that behavioral insight study, we go further to more deeper study. We conduct some of the surveys, interviews. We go to the ground. With my consultant team, we go to the ground to understand what is the needs. To understand them is to know what is their needs, their goal for the business. So that's why we classify into the 5 categories of informal entrepreneurs, where which one has high motivation to register, which one has very least but has high needs to increase capability to formalize the business. So under these 5 categories, we look specifically into the experimental, opportunistic, as well as not seasonal. We have very quite structured regulatory framework to tackle the issues. But for the opportunistic and experimental, it has an uninformed. We have categorized these 3 groups must be helped. We have to handhold them and transit them from the informal to a formal sector structuredly. So the 6 strategies actually focus more on this type of entrepreneurs because we understand their motivation, their goal. Some of them has very high motivation but very lack of capability. So we have some sort of the intervention program for them. In Malaysia, we don't have very specific initiatives or very specific programs for informal. Only during the pandemic, we have initiative under recovery plan for entrepreneurs and cooperatives. One of the initiatives is schemes for financing scheme for informal entrepreneurs. But we continue it under the existing program after the pandemic. But the requirement we improve where besides having just give them the facilities, we also put the condition they have to formalize the business within the period after they finish the some sort of their lending scheme, or at one period they have to formalize if they want to upscale. If you want to go for upscaling, definitely you have to formalize their business. That's how we work at the Malaysia. So that the understanding the informal actors is very important for us to architectural approach of the strategies and initiative.
Oh, thank you. That's really instrumental.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Norman, can you hear me? Or maybe I should go there, no?
Yes.
Yes. Hello,
Yes,
Norman. Thank
yes,
you so much. Norman, you know, part of the key elements table that we have proposed is that, of course, our economies can develop sound public policies if we, as Ms. Zoraida mentioned, if we understand the informal sector challenges. And we, of course, we cannot include all, but we, of course, this is a very multidimensional topic and includes many actors. But one of them also has to be with people who live in remote areas. So, following your excellent presentation, what could you suggest us how to deal with informality in remote areas?
The challenge that you present, Renato, is very difficult because remote areas may not have access to even basic infrastructure, such as electricity, much less access to internet. So in that case, in remote areas, it may be best for the entrepreneurs to actually come to more urban places. So there are two approaches. One is, in fact, to bring the public infrastructure and public services to them. Another approach is to facilitate the migration to more urban centers where these public services can be best provided. And it will depend really on the characteristics of each country. For some countries, it may be just impossible to bring up these public services to very remote areas. I'm thinking of the Amazon jungle in Peru, for instance. And in that case, it may be best to bring the entrepreneurs closer to more populated centers. But this should not diminish the challenge that the governments have of providing these services. But if I may just take one minute to answer something that you said in relation to what informal sector entrepreneurs think about the business environment. We recently conducted a survey of informal entrepreneurs in 3 cities in Peru. And what we found was something very, very revealing. First, number one, we found that not many of them, in fact, the majority of them didn't see the benefits of formalization. So for them, it was not a clear decision to become formal. They did see that they would gain certain advantages from formalization, but the cost of formalizing or the cost of remaining formal was for them overwhelming. So that is the bad news. The formal sector must be made more attractive to entice these people, these entrepreneurs, to join in. That's the possibly negative news. But the positive news is that if you compare these entrepreneurs, these informal entrepreneurs, we see that there is a higher interest in participating in the formal sector of those entrepreneurs who are younger and therefore more innovative, entrepreneurs who tend to be more educated, and entrepreneurs who tend to have more capital. So those that have actually more possibilities to gain from becoming members of the formal sector, those are also the most interested in joining in. So again, I want to repeat the challenge that I think we should all take seriously, that we need to make formality attractive before we can actually think about formalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. Very, very powerful statements. And now the floor is open for you, dear colleagues. Please, China. Chile afterwards.
Thank you. May I just speak at this?
Please, yes.
Thank you, Renato. It's Acting Song from China. It's very interesting discussion, and thank you for convening this. And thanks all for the excellent presentations, which are thought-provoking. China has all kind of types of economy, including informal economy. In China, we call them gig economy, which literally means economic activities with very informal and individual participation of those small scale, but largely depends on internet and digital platforms and co-sharing platforms, including taxi drivers, the food delivery, and the online sales and online training and consulting. So for those, it's a real big scale in China, and also promoting great employment and also raise the incomes. So surprisingly, those engaged in these activities are very high income, not necessarily low wage. It's sometimes we have a delivery of food with only $1 or $2, but it could happen millions of times in several hours. So you can imagine the whole scale is huge, and the government is engaged in good management of all this, and also to ensure they are in healthy development, and also have standardized services quality, and at the same time to improve the skills of those to have added value, at the same time to ensure their benefits. So the discussion we have is very interesting, and is so important for APEC. If we could do something, it's amazing. Maybe we are taking the lead of all the international forums on this. So here comes two questions from us, if the panelists and colleagues could share. First is that across the APEC region, there's member economies with different stages of development in different situations, and we may have different concepts concerning informal economy, and the percentage may also vary. So how could we find some common conceptual understanding of this, and to get more common ground and to have a good basis for discussion? This is the first. The second is that when we discuss about the protection of those actors and also their benefit, it may have discussion related to the social perspective, including their rights. So how to treat this, because it may have some legal discussion of rule making, may have some binding nature. There's other bodies who are dealing with that, including the United Nations. So APEC is an economic forum with non-binding nature. So how could we treat it, and without overlapping the work by the other international bodies, including ILO? and etc. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Enli. A very interesting question. Norman, could you answer the first one on the definition? And maybe Rory, the second one, do you think? Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Renato, and thanks for the question. On the issue of a common concept, I think we have to be pragmatic here. There will not be a single definition that will be acceptable to all, but I think that we can all agree that the informal sector is a very diverse set of activities that are partially or completely outside of the regulatory and legal framework. If we go by that general definition, then we can attempt certain measurements. On the labor side, for instance, we can follow the ILO example and have the measure of the informal sector workers by those that don't contribute to a pension system. Or we can also have a measurement that deals with workers that are not registered. We can take this same perspective and apply it to firms, and then look at the proportion of firms that are working under a proper registration and attempt a measure of those that are not. But I believe that the common concept is something well understood. We can agree on different measurements. But I think more important than the measurements even is that we have a common strategy. The common strategy can have the same components, but the importance of each of these components for each economy can be different. So, for instance, if we identify business entry, business location, labor, taxation, and dispute resolution, and business exit, let's say that we define these as the areas, and then we measure for each economy the difficulties in formalization represented in each of these areas, then we can apply for the different economies a measure of the different gaps. So the framework is the same. The measurement with respect to these gaps will be different for each economy. And that would be something like a scorecard that APEC or any other organization can use. In this regard, we at the World Bank can help out by providing this assessment of the business readiness in the economy. This assessment can also be an assessment of the degree to which formalization is attractive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman. I just want to add a little bit of my own experience when dealing with senior officials in year 2021. And I remember Canada, my counterpart in Canada told me that informality for Canada is about people who are getting less benefits, social benefits, for instance. He said to me that it was about gig economy workers. When I talked to my Korean colleague, he told me that informality is it could be in Korea within the formal economy, when they are under contracting. When I talked to the US, I remember he told me that it's about creating decent jobs. So the purpose is from bringing this topic is not really providing a concept, because as we are a diverse kind of economies, we think that the realities are different between us, and it could be adapted to our own reality. No? Please, the second one, and also and after also.
Well, I'd like to thank China for the comment in question. I know there was a lot more richness in your comment than the small part I'm going to answer, but at the end, you did make the very valid point that we should ensure that APEC doesn't duplicate the work of other international organizations in this area, and I couldn't agree more strongly. the fact is that I think that we are somewhat behind other organizations that have gone a long way in studying these areas, and we should bring that work, as we are doing today with the various experts that are present, into our organization. But I think the really beautiful thing about APEC is that it comes at these issues in another way. And that is that we're really about economic and technical cooperation. We actually sit down together, we compare experiences, we see what works, what doesn't, and what might work in our circumstances. And in many cases, that helps us to take these issues forward. Now, I can only give you an example from my own experience where in structural reform, say competition policy and law, when I first started, there were a lot of APEC economies that didn't have competition policy and law. And there had been a lot of work in international institutions, bilateral aid programs, trying to persuade partners to adopt competition policy, and those had gone so far. But when we took it into APEC, then that provided the ability of economies to share experiences with each other. And often it's the economy that's just one step ahead of their other counterpart economy that provides the most valuable insights. And I have to say that, I saw the grasping of the need to pick up competition policy, and that actually translating into reform in the host economies. Today, every APEC economy has competition policy and law, and I think the APEC process helped a lot with that, in partnership with all the other processes that were available. It's not an either-or thing, it's the particular contribution that APEC can make.
Thank you, Rudy. David? Maybe the microphone. Not yet. The microphone, maybe.
Thank you so much. Before directly answering that question, I want to express a concern that will be directly related to my answer to your question. In the first two presentations, we saw something undoubtedly important, the formalization of small businesses, which is undoubtedly better than those businesses not being formalized. My concern, nevertheless, my suspicion, is that in an even better world, some of those now formalized small business owners would be even better off and more productive as formal employees, formal wage workers. Why do I express this concern? Because if we establish the goal as formalization, we would say success. But under a broader set of goals, we might say we've made progress, but we're still not all the way there. With that in mind, my proposal to answer your question is, let's go to a set of characteristics that we can all agree are important. We want people to be, this is my proposal, we want people to be in the most, working in the most productive way possible. We want them to be earning high wages, as high as is reasonable given their productivity. And we want people to be protected against shocks. We want people to have reasonable pensions. We want people to be able to have access to health care, things like this. Now, I suspect if we have an agenda that leads us to higher productivity, people earning high wages, people being protected against shocks, when we go check, we'll see formalization has increased. And I would even say something a little bit maybe provocative. If it turns out that someone is as productive as they could be, and they're receiving a high wage, and they have sufficient social protection, and it turns out by some definition of informality they're informal, maybe we could live with it. So my short answer to your question, or my suggestion, is go to first principles. What are the characteristics of formality we would like to promote, and set those as the objectives: productivity, higher wages, protection against shocks, and that would perhaps allow us, by the way, those are all clearly characteristics related to formality, but that might perhaps allow us to avoid debates about how should we define formality or informality. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Rory. Chile, please.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to start. I don't have many questions, maybe one or two, but I wanted to start by thanking Renato and all the panelists, because it has been very interesting, quite difficult, some concepts for me yet, and that is going to be one of my questions to Mr. Kaplan later. But I think it's a very enriching panel, and I think that it's very wise to talk about this in APEC. Because APEC is, in APEC we share best practices. And we were looking at the figures and the graphs. I saw Chile. I'm a representative from Chile. Chile like in the middle. But how important it is in a forum like APEC, and that's why I congratulate Peru for putting this as a priority, because we can share experiences like Malaysia just talked to us about your successful experience in transitioning from informal to formal. And I think this roadmap in APEC is very useful, because we can all share experience and we can learn from the lessons from other economies that have success in transitioning from informal to formal. And having said that, my first question goes to Rory, because of course you talked about the importance of having this in the architecture of APEC, but my question goes more in detail, like in which committee, or I know it's a cross-collaboration issue, but which would be the best or the main committee where you suggest that this roadmap should be worked? That's my question. And I also wanted to comment on Norman's surprise about the 3 towns in Peru that where people didn't really want to move from informal to formal. And this is something that calls my attention also because it's the case in Chile also. I mean, I was talking with Corinne before in the coffee, because even if you have all the tools in place, there's a cultural thing. And you see that people still prefer to maintain being in the informality. Maybe it's, well, and I also agree with what Norman said, that maybe the younger people, and of course education has a great role to play here, but the public awareness and the responsibility of make it more attractive, I think, is key also. And that as a comment. And finally, I would like if Mr. Kaplan could tell me or tell us a little bit more about the universal pensions, because I found it quite interesting, but I don't know how that works in reality, especially in developing countries. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marcella. It's great to see you again. The question of where it should sit in APEC, it could sit in several places. You're right, it's a very cross-cutting issue, like all the inclusion issues, I think, are cross-cutting. I went to a a workshop which was jointly run, in collaboration between the Group on Services and the Economic Committee about essentially looking at the sort of progress in regulatory reform of services sectors, good regulatory practice, bringing in digital technologies, etc. I was really struck by the work that was being done in many developing economies to really grasp the nettle of reform of what I was talking about before, the key sectors in the services area, telecommunications, digital, etc., so that it could yield much greater benefits to to poorer people, to small business, to people in the informal economy. Because of that, I am biased quite clearly, but I actually think probably the best coordinating group would be the Economic Committee, with that regulatory, structural reform lens overall, but in very close collaboration, like all other inclusion work with other bodies, with all the bodies having a clear sense of what their contribution to this issue should be and what their accountabilities are. I mean, it's impossible. I really don't think it would be helpful to set up a new group on this at all, because A, it's not sort of possible in APEC at the moment, but B, I think you get the real strength of the contribution of APEC by bringing the other expertise to bear on this issue. And so I think that you need one coordinating group and then others with a very clear sense of what they are doing. I know that is what Peru is trying to achieve through the roadmap. So, yeah.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Rory. Norman, could you answer the second question on how to encourage?
Yes.
Or is it David? Norman, okay. Go ahead, Norman.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the question is really great. Thank you, Ms. Marcela, for raising the point of changing the culture of workers and entrepreneurs. I completely agree that this is a goal. I believe that it can be achieved partially by promoting public awareness on the benefits of formalization. That's where digitalization can play a role. But public awareness is not enough. Then the business environment must be propitious, because entrepreneurs, informal entrepreneurs, are in fact very able people, very able entrepreneurs. They can really see the road ahead, not just the beginning. They don't see that formalization would last only through registration. They see that actually associated with formalization comes taxes, and comes a fiscalization, and comes a particular way of respecting laws and regulations. So awareness is wonderful. Changing social norms, wonderful too. But at the same time, we need to change the economic incentives. And finally, if I may, I want to support very much David Kaplan's perspective on what is relevant. I don't think that the way to achieve better outcomes, including better formalization of the economy, is by formalizing inefficient small businesses. I think the way to do this is by actually increasing the number of people associated with formal enterprises, and they may be of a larger size. Sometimes people say that we don't have enough entrepreneurship. Possibly, we actually have too much entrepreneurship. We need more people working in these successful firms and not trying to start a one-person firm many times. So thank you for this.
Thank you, Norman. Forget David?
So I may need the, oh, it's working.
Now it's working.
Perfect, great. First of all, I also want to not say anything new, but maybe frame the results, the very interesting results from that Norman told us from the Peruvian survey. I want to express it in a way, and Norman, if you think I'm being unfair, feel free to correct me, but what I heard was the owners of informal businesses see productivity gains of formalization. Nevertheless, they don't think it's profitable to do so. So whereas one might be tempted to say, well, if they're better off informal, leave them alone, the important thing is there, from the country's perspective, there would be productivity gains, just like the very nice pie chart where the pie got bigger if we could, improve formalization. There are productivity gains if we could find a way that these business owners find it to be in their interest to engage in production in the more productive manner. And now I want to address directly the question on how universal pensions work. I would just like to say several of the economies in Latin America that I know the best already have, by the way, Chile is an example, that have or pretty close to having universal pensions. Chile is a place where not only is the non-contributory pension getting closer and closer to being universal, but the amount is increasing. Mexico is another country where there is now a non-contributory pension getting closer and closer to being universal, and with the amounts increasing. Bolivia is another country in which is another economy in which there is essentially a universal non-contributory pension. And in other places, this is not the case. They're focusing their fiscal expenditure with limited fiscal space in other areas. What I would like to suggest as a thought experiment for the economies that so far have chosen to have very close to universal non-contributory pensions is that when they design the structure and the parameters of their contributory pensions, whether there might be some space to allow people and their firms to contribute less to the contributory pension, given the fact that there is a universal non-contributory pension. So what I would say is there are examples of developing economies that have already that are already making the effort to have close to universal non-contributory pensions. And what I would suggest is maybe in addition to the social benefits of a universal non-contributory pension, there are unexploited benefits of lowering the costs of formality, because if I start out with a non-contributory pension of a fairly important amount, perhaps, and again, especially for the low-income people that are the most difficult to formalize, perhaps, both for them and for their employers, we could allow them to contribute a little bit less, lowering the cost of formalization and generating both formalization and productivity benefits associated.
Thank you, David. Any additional question from our fellow economists or delegations? If not, I think it's a good time to give to all our panelists a big applause. Please.
Thank you all for that interesting discussion. This exchange will better inform the roadmap on the transition to the formal and global economy. These experiences can help us better understand the role of digital connectivity in the formalisation process in the Asia Pacific. Thank you to all our presenters, participants, and all those present today. This concludes the dialogue. Please enjoy your lunch.
Sure. Okay. Okay.
What?
Oh, stay seated right here. Okay, I thought we were going to stand. Oh.